Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started today? Um, Hi everyone, aloha, hafa and good afternoon. For all of you attending from either Hawaii, Guam, or the mainland, my name is Al Ogata. I'm President and CEO of Cyber Hawaii. Hopefully you can see my slides. So for those of you who don't know us, Cyber Hawaii is a nonprofit information sharing and workforce development organization that focuses on improving cyber resiliency in Hawaii's small and mid-sized businesses, as well as within the community as a whole. We're supported through membership dues provided by the organization shown here. These organizations recognize the value of improving the cyber resilience of all organizations within the state and are helping to build strong cybersecurity architectures outside of the boundaries of their own networks. We're also supported by strategic partners at the state of Hawaii and by federal agencies such as DHS, CISA, the FBI, Coast Guard, and Secret Service. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar on vulnerability management. The goal of vulnerability management is to reduce the prevalence and impact of vulnerabilities and exploitable conditions across enterprises and technologies, including through assessments and coordinated disclosure of vulnerabilities reported by trusted partners. Having processes and procedures that define how you'll deal with vulnerabilities, both within your business and that are presented to you by the outside environment, is critical to your long-term success and survival. For an administrative standpoint, any questions you have should be entered into the chat window, and we'll read them at pauses in the presentation. The presentation is also being recorded, and the recording will be available on the Cyber Hawaii website in a few days. In addition, the presenter has agreed that you can contact him after today's presentation should you have any questions or need assistance. His email address will appear during the presentation. So with that being said, I'd like to introduce your presenter for today, Mr. Giovanni Williams. Mr. Williams is a cybersecurity infrastructure security at Structure and Security Agency, CISA, cybersecurity advisor, or the CSA, for the state of Hawaii and the U.S. territory of American Samoa. Giovanni is a seasoned cybersecurity subject matter expert with over 2 decades of experience spanning military, private sector, and federal government roles. He currently serves as a cybersecurity advisor for CISA, where he provides strategic leadership in fortifying the national critical infrastructure against evolving cyber threats. He's a certified information systems security professional and a recognized subject matter expert in cybersecurity strategy, risk management, and information security governance. His extensive experience in cyber threat intelligence, incident response, and regulatory compliance makes him a trusted advisor in the field. And with that, I'll turn the session over to Gio. Giovanni, it's all yours.
Hey, thanks, Al. And thanks, everybody. Appreciate you having me today. And just give me a moment. Let me get my slides up really quickly, and we can begin the session. All right. Hopefully, everyone can see that. My screen is consumed now, so I can only see what you see. So thanks again, everybody, for having me. And the topic of today's discussion is vulnerability management. It's a very broad topic, but I will do my best to kind of give you a very good overview and an understanding of some of the key concepts so that you can implement those in your day to day and build resilience in your organization. So, as Mr. Ogata said, I'm from the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. So we are basically America's cyber defense agency. We're the national coordinator for critical infrastructure. We work with 16 sectors of critical infrastructure throughout the nation. There's at least one of myself in every state. So if you have colleagues in other states that are looking for someone like myself, please just let me know and I can get them in contact with their counterpart. But CISA has a very deep role in providing resilience for the nation. So today's topic, vulnerability management. Here's a look at what we're going to go over today. So I'm going to give you an introduction to vulnerability management. We're going to go over some life cycle things that you need to understand within vulnerability management. We're going to go over vulnerability identification. So how do you go about identifying the vulnerabilities? Then we're actually going to dive into some risk prioritization. So what your approach is in evaluating those vulnerabilities. Then we're going to dive into some remediation and mitigation tactics. I'm going to explain the difference between remediation and mitigation. Then we're going to dive into some reporting and metrics. I'm going to give you some capabilities of some tools and some automation that you can look towards within your environment. I wish I could be tool specific, but because I work for the federal government, we can't do that. But I will identify some key capabilities that you can take advantage of if you are looking to source some tools from a vendor and such. Then I'm going to go over some common challenges that you may face in your day to day, and then I'll open it up to Q&A. All right. So the first thing, so what is vulnerability management? And I'm just going to read the definition. It's the continuous proactive process of identifying, assessing, prioritizing, remediating, and reporting on security vulnerabilities in systems and software. And there's also another element that's not identified. So a lot of people don't think of, well, a lot of people do think of people as a resource, but people can have vulnerability as well. So when you're implementing your vulnerability management plan, you also want to look at like people from a strategic perspective. But the vulnerability management program is a lot of different things, and we're going to cover those things in some pretty decent detail today. But the overarching goal of vulnerability management is to reduce your attack surface. So that is based on your environment and what you have. We want to reduce the capability of someone breaking into your stuff or hacking your stuff. And we want to improve your resilience. So basically, we want to improve your ability that if that does happen, you're able to reconstitute your business and continue your operations. Some of the objectives of vulnerability management, number one being awareness. You have to understand what you have to protect. That's one of the core pillars. So you have to understand your assets, your information, your system, just those things that you're trying to protect. Another objective is structure. So in order to have a good vulnerability management program or a vulnerability management team, you have to have a standardized, systematic, and a repeatable approach because it's never going to stop. This is not a one and done. This is something that's reoccurring on a reoccurring basis. Some of you may have heard of Microsoft Tuesdays. That's every other week. So you're definitely going to have a repeatable, standardized, and a systematic approach to this. Tools. So there's two types of tools that you want to look at as an objective. There are technical tools that you can use, and there are non-technical tools. And I will go over some of those tools in a later slide, but just identify that as a future objective. And one of the other important pillars is effective decision making. So we're going to go over some different frameworks and methodologies that you can use in your day-to-day to make sure that you're taking the right approach, not only in identifying and building your program so that it's standardized, systematic, and repeatable, but also in evaluating what brings value to your organization and how to evaluate those risks. All right, so the first thing you have to do before you start diving into vulnerability management is you have to choose a framework. And I have a couple of frameworks on the slide here just to point you in a direction. But I would like to preface that there is no one size fits all kind of framework. You kind of pick one, and actually some of these frameworks kind of coincide with each other. So for instance, you can start off as like a baseline under the NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology cybersecurity framework. Say you pick that one. But you also have like a retail component within your organization. So you're also going to pull in the payment card industry data security standard. Or instead of you having a retailer, maybe you are an organization and you work with, say, a health provider. So they might have health information that has to be protected in a certain way. So not only are you going to use your NIST standard, but you're also going to use HIPAA, the HIPAA Act, or the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. And you can you can build this different Lego of a program, but you have to start out in at least choosing one. So choose a framework, and if you do need some support in identifying what the best framework is, please let myself know, let Al know. We can sit down with you to try to understand what you have, and what would make sense for your organization. All right, so once you have your framework identified, then next, what we're going to start going into is the life cycle of vulnerability management. So if you remember earlier, I said that it's not a one and done kind of a concept. So on the right side, I've identified a graph that kind of walks you through the life cycle. On the left side, there's a description of some of the tasks within the graph, but the graph on the right side is like the proper, I guess, identified way to the proper terms. So the first thing you have to start off with is you have to identify what it is you're trying to protect. The second thing is you want to protect it. And when I say protect it, so I will back up. So in identifying, you want to discover. So you want to identify all your assets, your hardware, your software, your cloud, your network components, your people, your information. You want to identify everything it is that you're trying to protect, or you want to discover it. And there's different ways you can do that. The second thing, when we're on the right side where it says protect, so what you want to do is you want to organize those assets. So basically, you want to classify those assets or separate those assets into different groups based on the type of asset, whether that's like a network system asset, um, business criticality. So maybe instead of a network asset having criticality within your business, maybe there's some other component of your business that's more important. Or that network asset may be the most important thing in your business. Every scenario is unique, so you want to actually separate those assets into criticality. So whatever the most critical asset is in the business, you want to separate those by owners as well, because when you're communicating out with the rest of your organization, you want to make sure you understand who is responsible for what. And also, when you're looking at those assets from a criticality, an owner perspective, based on the type, you also want to evaluate the exposure of that asset. So, if that asset is exposed or is compromised, how is that going to affect your business? So that's the second part. That's to protect. The next part, what we're going to move into, is the detect. The detection part is basically you want to assess those assets. So this is where a technical tool can help you, unless you have another, well, it's also a technical tool too, but another way to basically assess those assets. If you already have a configuration management or change management plan in place, if you have a good record standardization system, then you can basically kind of track your assets that way as well. But you definitely want to discover, you want to start scanning those assets for vulnerabilities. And there's different methodologies that you can use to scan those assets based on certain criterias. And I'm going to go into that in a later slide. But you definitely want to scan and evaluate those assets to detect like known vulnerabilities, misconfigurations, or legacy systems, outdated software, things of that nature. The next portion that we'll move into is the respond. And when I'm talking about responding, I'm talking about when something happens, you're going to have your teams and your organization responding to what you were trying to protect based on what you detected and you identified. and how you're going to respond. So when you're responding, you want to prioritize your vulnerabilities based on your risk levels and other considering factors that you may have in your organization. We're going to talk about that on a later slide of how when you're separating out those things, you're classifying them and you evaluate them, you're going to come up with a concept of ranking them based on I'm trying not to give too much away, but based on how important they are to your organization, um, considering the type of attack that you just had. So that's the respond and prioritize portion of the life cycle. The next portion is recover. So after your response and you've worked with your teams based on the criticality of what you just responded to, now you have to recover. And in recovering, you're either going to mitigate or you're going to remediate, or vice versa. You can say them either way. But the key phrase here is you're going to fix what is broken, or you're going to try to change whatever was affected um, through either patching, configuration changing, or configuration changes, or some type of compensating control. And for those, like when I was talking earlier about non-technical versus technical types of things, those are controls. So you can have a technical control or a non-technical control. They can be compensating or non-compensating. But that's a whole nother conversation I'll dive into later. The next portion is improve. So after you recover from, what has just happened in your organization and you remediated it and you fixed it, and hopefully you've documented all this, all of the challenges that took place, and when you fixed it and you tested it, it worked the first time or it didn't work to the second time. If there was some unique anomaly that made it only work on this time, hopefully you've documented all that stuff. That way, when you get to the improve phase or the validation phase, where you retest the systems to confirm that everything worked and that the vulnerability no longer works, and then you're going to kind of transition into the report phase at the same time. That is where you document those findings, those actions taken, and the current status of your vulnerabilities, whether you close it or it's open. That way you can do what is called like continuous service improvement or continuous improvement. That way, the next time this happens, you don't have to start over from nothing. And that's the whole point of the life cycle, is to keep it to where you're always getting information so that you can constantly improve. That's how you build maturity within your organization. With these frameworks, is that you're constantly taking what you've learned and bringing it forward and utilizing it the next time you have an incident, so that you don't do the same thing over and over again, and you can respond in a quicker fashion. All right, so after the life cycle, we're gonna go into some of the portions of the life cycle now. So the first one is vulnerability identification. So this was the discovery. So in order to understand what you have to protect, you have to know what it is. So there's different ways to do this. You can do a manual way where you have your people and they go out and they look at everything, and you have them making Excel spreadsheets and plugging stuff in, and that's a really difficult way, but it is a way. So if you don't have the resources to do some of the technical or the automated approach ways, then you work with what you have. But a common way that folks understand what they have, especially from a technical perspective, is scanning their environments or their networks for what they have, whether that's software, hardware, etc. And there's two types of scans. So one is an authenticated scan, and what an authenticated scan is like, you have login credentials. You're a user on the environment, so you're like a trusted user, and you're able to get very in-depth results as an authenticated scan. So when you're using authenticated scans, they should be very in depth because you're setting them up. Though setting up authenticated scans are a little bit more complicated than unauthenticated, but the authenticated scans can be set up in a way to where you're scanning everything, and you're getting very very robust information sets or data sets for you to work off of when you're looking at what you have to protect. Another way to scan is an authenticated scan. And this is also a form of validation. But authenticated scans, basically you have no credentials. You're like an external user. So if you think of like if you've ever had a penetration test or some type of team come in and evaluate your environment, a lot of times they would, well, I'll say because we give you the choice. A lot of times people prefer them to use authenticated scans because they'll get more information. But if you kind of want to understand where some of your unknown vulnerabilities are, having a red team go in with unauthenticated scans and actually exploiting what they find is another way of one identifying some of the holes in your program, but also it's just to see the capabilities of the team. But and for your validation purposes, if you're doing an authenticated scan and you're remediating and patching and fixing, and then you do an unauthenticated scan and you're still seeing the ability or some of the vulnerabilities that you had or you thought you fixed, then you might want to reapproach it. So the next concept outside of scanning is like the CVEs. If you've ever heard or if you've ever gotten any of our responses from CISA, we have basically when we give you a vulnerability, it has what's called a CVE or a common vulnerability and exposure explanation. And basically what that is basically a dictionary of public vulnerabilities and exposures. So basically that dictionary has descriptions and it's kind of like a across the board description of that vulnerability and kind of how it's exploited. So when you see the acronym CVE in a vulnerability, it stands for Common Vulnerability and Exposure, and you can look those up via that dictionary. And there's another tool that I'm going to talk about a little bit that's tied to CVEs that'll also give you some of the core information. The next thing for identification is, or for vulnerability identification, is the threat intelligence feeds. And what those are, they're basically just streams of data that provide security teams with real-time insights of emerging cyber threats and vulnerabilities. So this is one of those technical automated approaches that if you have the capability, your team can be plugged into this continuous discussion of vulnerabilities that just float across the the internet, or not just the internet, but it's a collective of different organizations that share this information. So it's definitely a way for you to look at your vulnerabilities. So like after you scan, you've identified an IP address and you've associated with a CVE, which can be tied to a known exploited vulnerability, and I'll talk about that later. And you can associate that with, or if it's popping on your threat intelligence feed as like a common vulnerability that is identified out in the wild, then you might want to approach it because it's more than likely going to have like some type of criticality, and it's going to tell you how to fix it. So this slide right here, I wanted to give you an example of what we just talked about. So this scan in particular, this is an actual authenticated scan. It is using a application, and I'm not. Please don't. When I say the company, I'm not trying to sell this company, but I just want you to understand the context of the slide. But this is a Tenable Nessus product. And this product is a common scanning tool that a lot of enterprise networks use. I'm familiar with it, so I just kind of wanted to describe it to you. So as you can see, this is what an authenticated scan that has been set up, and in this scanning tool, it out of the box it's going to scan, but you have to set it up to scan for your environment. Every environment is unique, so when you implement any type of scanning tool, there's a configuration setup that you're going to have to go through with either your vendor or your team in order to configure it so that it's scanning how you need it to scan based on your risk and things of that nature. But as you can see, the scan is giving back results. In this scan, if you look, there's tabs, and one of the tabs to the left, the far left, is host. So that is more than likely the client that is involved, or the computer that's out within this network. They've identified that computer by its IP address, so they're either using DHCP, or I don't know if this is static, because you can do 192s as static, but it's normally DHCP. But they've identified those clients, and each one of those clients, if you look at the bar and what color code it is, and in towards the bottom right, you see the vulnerability little circle. If it's that burgundy color, it's a critical vulnerability. If it's red, it's high. If it's orange, it's medium, and then that kind of yellowish goldish color is low, and then all the blue are just informationals. And what informationals are is, it may not be a vulnerability, it's an informational entry that tells you that there may be something of note there that you want to review. Not saying that it can be exploited right now, but who knows. So usually with the informationals, when you first set up your scanning tool, I had my team parse through all those first so that we knew, one, what was identified already, and two, that we've covered our bases. And once we've covered our bases, as long as, if it kept giving the same result, then, we never had to worry about it anymore because we had already cataloged it. But if it was a new result, then we had a review process for it. But remember that the criticality of these vulnerabilities are based on what you tailored it for. So in this particular organization, their criticals, I mean, who knows, what risk picture that they use in order to kind of set this up. But just food for thought, when you're setting this up, the criticality of the vulnerability, it can be tailored based on your organization, or you can just go with the common vulnerability score, which is something that I'll talk about in a little bit. Also, if you look, there's tabs for the vulnerabilities, so you can drill down into this a little bit further by clicking on that tab, and then it also will tell you about the remediations for those vulnerabilities, so how to fix it, and then just the VPR top threats, which is basically based on this environment. They have kind of like a categorized list of the top threats that you should be on the lookout for. All right, so we just kind of closed on the identification portion. Now we're going to get into the categorization portion. So you've kind of scanned, you kind of understand what you're trying to protect. Now you have to you have to categorize it so that you know how to protect it based on its criticality. So what we're gonna dive into now is how to evaluate the risk of those vulnerabilities. And I'm gonna do my best because risk assessment can be a whole field within itself. But I wanted to cover a lot of the bases for you. So what is a risk? The definition of risk is the potential for an event or circumstance to negatively impact a company's ability to achieve its financial goal or continued existence. And that risk definition was based on a business definition of risk. I focused on that. If you look up risk, basically you're going to get this equation here. So risk equals the likelihood of something happening times its impact. And if you look, likelihood equals the vulnerabilities, threats, exposure, and security controls. And then the impact equals business criticality. So how much it's going to affect the business. So when you're evaluating risk, remember this formula. But I'm going to give you some other tools to help you kind of look at your risk and kind of categorize them. All right, so when you're prioritizing your risk or you're looking at your vulnerabilities or how the different assets in your environment and you're prioritizing them, what you want to do is you want to kind of get a methodology on how to approach it. So risk prioritization, so the process of ranking identified risks from most to least critical based on their likelihood of occurrence and their potential impact. So if you look at this graph that I'm showing, it's basically a risk assessment kind of picture. What you want to do is when you're looking at your risk, so your vulnerability, or actually, excuse me, your asset, because there's two layers to this. So the first one is your asset. So when you're looking at your asset, so say your asset is your internal firewall. So if and this is just an example, I just want to kind of run through the methodology. So your internal firewall, let's just say that if something were to happen to your internal firewall, your team has basically said that the impact would be significant. So we're going to go to top row first. So your team has identified that the impact would be significant. Let's just say that. And you also need to look at what is the potential or the probability or the likelihood of that actually happening. So if you're saying that if our internal firewall was compromised, it would be significant, then what is the likelihood of that happening? Well, we have our internal firewall. So if our internal firewall is the only firewall, then the likelihood is probably higher. But if you have a designated boundary where you have a setup where you have an external firewall and then you have a DMZ and then you have your other firewall, or I don't know how many layers of firewall you want to have, but some people have their external firewall, they have a DMZ, then they have a boundary firewall, and then from their boundary firewall they have another firewall. I've seen that in setups. So now you have like a defense in depth or a layered approach to your boundary. So let's say the likelihood of it happening, we'll say possible. So it'll have significant impact and it's possible. So where those two meet is that this would be a medium to high on the risk prioritization. So when you're say you do get a data breach and it is your firewall, or your firewall has some type of compromise, and it's this one that we just prioritized. Say it's that one, but then say your external one, you said it's severe, and then let's say very likely because it's on your external boundary. When it comes to prioritizing those two assets, you would prioritize the external firewall for mitigation prior to the internal firewall, because the external one has a higher, like a severe impact, and it's very likely to happen. You get that, so it's very high, versus a medium to high of your internal firewall. So when you're prioritizing your risk, it's not only just writing it down for later. It's when you're actually doing your incident response, you want to pull this stuff out based on what you've prioritized so that you can understand the impact and what, how you need to triage your approach to your response. All right. So also in looking at that graph that we were just on, there's some methodologies that you can use to help align it a little better. I was just kind of going through some scenarios based on just some things off the top of my head, but you also want to use like the common vulnerability scoring system, the CVSS. That's actually tied to the CVEs, or the common vulnerability exposure. It's also within the known exploited vulnerability catalog that I'm going to go over later. But all of these kind of tie together. So if you're seeing a vulnerability that has a common vulnerability score of critical, and you and or high or whatever, and within your matrix, within your prioritization, it's high as well, then it's more than probable it's something you want to look at, especially if it's in the realm of technology, or if it's within scope of whatever you prioritize. You might want to take a look at it just to see if you're impacted or you could be impacted. Another thing that you really want to consider when you're looking at that prioritization matrix, and probably one of the most important things when doing that prioritization matrix, is when you're prioritizing, it's not about the technology, it's always about the business. So if my firewall is compromised, and I was approaching it from a technical perspective, so I want to back up a minute. If my firewall was compromised on the outside, um, is it going to have any impact to the business operations? Like, are we still going to be able to like process stuff? Are we still going to have business continuity? Are we still going to be able to do the business? That's one of the key considerations when you're doing the risk prioritization for your environment. So I'm sorry, I was in my technical mind earlier, but I wanted to back up just to make it known that when it comes to the prioritization, the most important thing is the business. So how would this affect the business when it comes to impact, not just the technology or maybe bandwidth or degradation or capability to use it. Now, if you're saying that by not having your IT network, the business is halted, then yes, you have a challenge. But if the business can still function, but in a reserved or like a slower capacity, if they can still do the critical business functions, then you should be still good to go. But you would actually, in considering your prioritization, prior to that, you actually want to do some business impact analysis on just the different business aspects. So like your different business components and departments, to see like which department is the most important and why. And if something were to happen in this department, how is it going to affect the business? There's a whole process in evaluating the impact of disruption on different business components. And then the last thing is when it comes to the methods is exploit availability. So sometimes you'll see like an exploit, but there's a difference between an exploit that can be exploited from any computer on the earth. Then they need a specific tool set. And when I say specific tool sets, there are like tool sets that are designed to do specific things within the hacking community. So sometimes in order to exploit some of the more sophisticated approaches, they need to have like a sophisticated setup. So it all depends when it comes to exploit availability. But a lot of times the Kev will tell you exactly how the exploit occurs. Most of the time, I can't say all the time. Sometimes they know, sometimes they don't know. But a lot of the times, when it comes to the mitigation or remediation, they'll actually explain how the exploit works, and then you can kind of make a determination off of that. And I can't see if there's any questions, but I wanted to take a pause for a second there. Al, are there any questions so far?
Just looking at the chat, no, I see some references to some tools that CISA has, and also to a cyber defense community of interest. But at this point, no questions in the chat window. Do you want to pause? Does anyone have any questions? I'll poll it since we're paused right now. Any questions that you want to ask of Gio at this point, based on what he's talked about so far? Okay. Then, yeah. Gio, why don't you just keep going?
All right. And I know this is a lot of information. I'm trying to cover a lot in an hour, but I'm doing my best. So the next topic of discussion is remediation versus mitigation. And they're two separate things. So when you're thinking about remediation, um, this is to do something after something has occurred. So you when it comes to remediating, it's after. So you're remediating, like after a cyber attack, you're remediating. You're fixing something that was broken. When it comes to mitigation, it's proactive. It's trying to prevent something before it happens. So from a mitigation perspective, like CISA is all about mitigation. We try to proactively make strategies to prevent risks before they actually occur. So just remember that remediation. We're remediating. We got hacked. We're remediating stuff. We haven't been hacked yet. We're mitigating. We're mitigating this stuff before it happens. So in understanding those two concepts, so from a remediation perspective, um, immediate action. You want to make sure you correct it as soon as possible based on your prioritization, and then you want to focus on correcting whatever the violation is, or from a compliance perspective, violation, but you want to correct whatever the vulnerability is or whatever the challenge is within your environment, so that it could be less of a risk. And then so some examples, retaining staff, upgrading systems, just staying proactive. And then on the other side, ongoing monitoring and risk assessment. So you want to make sure that you're doing your scanning, your vulnerability scanning, both authenticated and authenticated. Using your CVE, your common exposure vulnerability dictionary, using the known exploited vulnerabilities, the scoring system, your different tools, non-technical and technical tools, and you just want to make sure that you're doing reoccurring audits. All right, so patching. Patching is a huge thing. And what that is the process of applying fixes, updates, modifications to software, operating systems, applications, people. You have to patch people with training. If you think of it that way, you that's how you patch your personnel, with training. But you have to stay on top of your patching of your environment, or it will increase your attack surface. It will expose you to more risk. So you want to make sure you stay on top of patching as best as you can. Having that systematic, structured, and repeatable approach will help tremendously in making sure you're not missing any gaps. One of the key components of any cybersecurity program is having a really good change management program. And it's change management, configuration management, whatever you want to call it. But it's basically a structured approach that your organization has to implement and manage changes effectively. Whether they involve individuals, so that's the coming and going of individuals. So that's your hiring and firing, your changing of personnel on teams. Like, you have to track that stuff to know what's happening within your organization so that you can react accordingly. And you want to track all the changes on your systems as best as you can, so that if anything occurs or you're patching and something doesn't work, it's easy for you to go back to how things were and kind of work your way back forward. It really helps with continuity of business. But change management is a foundational pillar of any cybersecurity program, and it's very important to have it. Temporary workarounds. You definitely, sometimes when you get these vulnerabilities, and you're looking at the technical documents and how to implement it, and you're trying to work through, like, how do I test this in a timely manner? If you don't have a testing node, you're just working straight off production. You definitely can think of some short-term things to reduce risk through, like, having a temporary workaround. And there's different ways you can do this. You can isolate, you can segment And segmentation is dividing a network into into smaller isolated segments, so that you just partition off that segment of the environment and kind of just have it separated for now until you can get to it, so it's not exposing everything else. Or you can completely isolate something. That means you restrict the communication. That means, I mean, that component or that part might not talk to the rest until you can get it fixed. Those are just some suggestions. There's many other temporary workarounds that you can utilize, but you definitely want to if at all possible, a temporary solution to reduce the risk now, while you work towards a permanent solution, is usually better than nothing. So just food for thought. All right. So earlier I showed you another graph to basically prioritize your risk. So now I want to talk about a technique. So after you've prioritized your risk and you're looking at ways to manage those risks, you're going to think about a couple of different things. So we talked about mitigation. So are you going to mitigate that risk? We've talked about, or we haven't talked about, the other three. So there's risk avoidance. Risk avoidance is where you don't even deal with it. You don't want it in your environment. You don't want to touch it. If it's a part of that system, we're not having it. We're gonna stay away from that. So that's risk avoidance. And if you look, that means if you're avoiding the risk, it more than likely has a high exploitability and a high impact. Anything above, that what I just explained within that quadrant where it says avoid, high exploitability, that means they can exploit it like it's like drinking water, and it's going to have a high impact to your environment. So that means you may not be able to constitute your business. And a lot of businesses at that point, they'll just avoid that risk. So maybe that component, we need to look for a different solution. Another risk management technique is to transfer the risk. And there's many different ways to transfer the risk. But I always warn folks, because a lot of people think that by transferring the risk, it removes them from the responsibility of that risk. That is not the case, because at the end of the day, that risk can still impact your business. But if it lessens the impact of your business, then that could be, like I said, that could be a temporary workaround or a solution to help. So the transfers of risk, a good example of that is, say for instance, and I'll use this as an example. Please don't think I'm saying to do this, but say for instance, if you get ransomware, right? And normally, if a business gets ransomware, then they're gonna have to pay a hefty fine. A way of kind of transferring some of that risk off of the business, especially if it depends on, and I don't know your business revenue, but if you expect those ransoms to be high in the revenue values where it would be a hardship for your business, and you think there's a high or a high impact on your business, or that there's a probability that your business could be ransomware, then a lot of people will get cybersecurity insurance. That way, with the payout. That way, if they do get ransomware, they know that the insurance will cover whatever the ransom may be, so they can get their data back. And then they will just pay the deductible, which is, I guess, is the trade-off for that cost that they would have had to eat on the revenue stream. So that's one example that off the top of my head makes sense. So I wanted to share that. That's a way of transferring risk. Other businesses transfer risk, or they think they transfer risk when they move to like cloud services and things of that nature. I would say to an extent, yes, you are kind of transferring the risk. I will challenge you this though, because most businesses, when they do cloud services, they don't read the contract as far as to who's responsible for what. So there's always some confusion when there's an incident as to who is actually supposed to provide the security. So if you have identified and documented like the proper, like who's responsible for what, then yes, there's a high probability you have. But if not, then you might want to look at it. So those are some examples of risk transference. And then the third one is just risk acceptance. So if it's low exploitability, low impact, you've looked at the common vulnerability score, it's low. The expected, exploitability is like low. Like they need this like tool that only maybe, I don't know, some secret agency of the United States has. Then I mean, it maybe that vulnerability that you've identified, you just accept it because the probability of someone exploiting it is very low, and you know that's what the masses are saying, based on the kev and the cvs score. Maybe you have your automated thing is saying the same thing, and then within your own internal risk matrix, as far as the likelihood versus the impact, maybe it's low. So then you can make a sound decision as, we'll just accept this, and document it. But this is a tool that a lot of businesses use. They use this in combination with the business impact analysis, in combination with the risk matrix that I've showed you earlier, along with just a lot of other data with risk professionals, to basically comb over this stuff to come to those risk conclusions. All right, so now we're moving on to, like, we did discovery, we categorized, we scanned, we know we made our risk matrices. We know what we have, how it impacts our organization, everything. Now let's say we have an incident, and we got through it. We had some things happening. We documented everything. Now it's time to report, on our after actions, lessons learned, and all the stuff. So we did a scan just to make sure that all the patches and stuff worked. So reporting and keeping metrics is a really important part of the vulnerability management program. So the first item is the mean time to remediate. So that is a performance metric. It's basically how long it takes, your team or the team you have assigned for your security stuff to resolve an incident, mitigate a vulnerability. You can use it for different things, but it's mostly resolving incidents, and then and fixing vulnerabilities after you've detected them. So you should there should be reports, within your organization about vulnerabilities that not only your technical teams receive, but also your executive leadership, especially when they're making business decisions. In your reporting, there's a couple of things you want to make sure that you're identified. Number one is, like, how many vulnerabilities do you have? The reports you're going to get from your scanners is going to tell you all this data, but it's important to understand your it's called your churn. So how many vulnerabilities do you have? So, like, if normally let's say your churn, you get vulnerability scan every week, and maybe your churn is 100 vulnerabilities, and in 1 week you get your churn, and all of a sudden you have 1,000. Well, now you have a problem. But not only that, you need to try to figure out, like, what happened, like, why all of a sudden, last week we had 100, this week we have 1,000, and it could happen. But it's definitely an anomaly, and you want to kind of keep track of that. If you constantly have 100, or let's say you constantly have 1,000, and then the number jumps up a little bit because maybe there was a major vulnerability that came out across multiple systems and platforms, and it was the same type of vulnerability. Maybe it affected the same kind of protocol, or it affected a port that all of these systems use. It can happen, but you definitely want to know how many vulnerabilities you're dealing with. Also, within your vulnerability report, you want to capture what is open. That means not fixed. What we're currently still working on, and you can have dispositions like, this one we've looked at, we've reviewed, we're working on a fix. Like, different dispositions let you know where you are in a stage. And then, but the most important ones are: is this open? Open means not fixed, and then closed means completely fixed, or no longer a concern. So open, concern; closed, not a concern. So those two are important. The other dispositions you can tailor based on your organization and your workflow of your process. But open and closed, you definitely want to have those. And then the last kind of thing to harp on, and this is internal and external. So whether you have like some people hire contract teams internal to their organization, some people hire them external. But if you want your service level agreements to be adhered to, whatever that is, so whatever your mean time to remediate, you should be giving that contractor or your third party those metrics so that they make sure that they meet them. And you want to make sure that those metrics are being enforced. If you in especially in this program, if you're not enforcing the metrics, and you're not enforcing the vulnerability program, then you're going to get behind, and then things aren't, it's going to get chaotic, and it could expose your business to more risk. So you want to make sure that when it comes to like any type of agreements or any type of enforcement, that you're actually enforcing the program and making sure that folks are adhering to the governance. And that's the governance is a non-technical control that you should be considering. All right, so as I said earlier, so now, and I kind of went over one of the tools earlier. That was the Tenable Nessus scan that I showed you. So that's one of the tools. It's a scanning tool. So with your tools, and so there's manual tools, there's automated tools. For scanners, there's different types of scanners. Just because you buy a scanner doesn't mean that scanner is going to have all the capabilities you need. So before you purchase a tool, you want to make sure that it encompasses all the capabilities that you need. So if you buy a web application scanner, and you need something to scan networks, then you're going to be, you bought the wrong tool, and then you're going to have to try to figure it out. So you want to make sure that you're buying the right tools. So different tools, and some of these tools have different modules that you can build into them, or that are add-ons. But if you're scanning your routers and your switches and your transport layer, you want a network scanner. If you're scanning your web applications, you want a web application scanner. Some network scanners have a built-in host-based scanner, but you want to ask to make sure. Always validate capabilities and your tools. But there's a different type of scanner for cloud-based services. There's a scanner for databases. And there's many open source scanners that have different tools and modules that you can take advantage of as well. Definitely want to make sure you have a good scanner, especially if you're trying to build out that asset list. So doing those discovery scans and trying to get the picture of what you're looking for. And then there are also different patch management tools. When I say patch management, so we were talking about patching earlier. And I said for your personnel or your humans, you want to make sure that their patching is their training. You want to keep them trained, and they need to be trained in whatever discipline it is you hired them for. So you want to make sure that the people who are working in specific roles are trained in those disciplines and are meeting whatever expectation that is. And a way of doing that is certifications. That's a way to make sure that they're meeting like certain minimum requirements. Not saying you have to do it, but I'm just giving you an option. But definitely make sure you train your people. For technical, there's different types of patch management systems. There is patch management systems that you can use for deployment modules. What that means is like if you're doing like tech refreshes and stuff like that, or you're updating your systems, there's a difference between an agent and an agentless system. So you want to make sure you understand the difference. One requires a person, one doesn't. And some of them have both where you can switch on and off, but you want to make sure that you're very familiar with what you're about to enter an agreement or purchase. And then there is a difference between a platform and an application patch management system. So make sure you're aware. And then there are systems that you can use for network integration or integrating different tools into your environment. And then also with the patch management system, just knowing your target audience, because some tools, depending on the level of expertise of your team, say for instance, if you're going out to buy a very sophisticated tool that your team has no expertise in, you can try to have the vendors teach them that, but it's going to take years. So just be aware if you're trying to buy like something sophisticated and you don't have already in-house capabilities, it's going to take you time to build up that capability. So if you can find something that someone is already familiar with and then build from there, that usually makes more sense. If not, then getting a tool that is less complicated and then kind of working your way up to the complicated tool is a better approach. And we were talking about integration. Integration tools that's integration of data, different data sets from different things. Because we were talking about frameworks earlier, and within those frameworks, I told you you can have different types of stakeholders or customers or different types of sectors that you're dealing with. So having a tool to help integrate that data through your systems is very helpful, especially when you want to segment that data so that it's not compromising other areas of your environment. And the last thing I'll talk about is if you're not familiar with automated, if you've never heard of Sticks and Taxis, Sticks and Taxis is basically a language for sharing information of a technical nature, and it's normally automated, but it's like it's agentless, so you don't need it. You can just set up a feed, and then you'll get this information as long as the tool supports Sticks and Taxis. And there's a lot of tools that support the Sticks and Taxis. So you can ask the vendor or whoever you're dealing with for your tool set if the tool that they built for you or that you're using supports Sticks and Taxis. And if it does, you can get things like we have our CIS's automated information sharing platform, and then you can ingest like all the data that I just told you about from like the KEV, the common vulnerability score system, the common vulnerability exposure. Like you can just ingest all that information without having to go out and find it every time. And then you can actually, when I was talking about integration earlier, all that data can be used to feed your scanning tool, and your scanning tool, based on how you programmed it, can utilize it to go ahead and categorize your results. So automation can help, lessen the burden on your personnel. All right, so some common challenges. First challenge, asset visibility. And this is not just from like scanning capability, but there's a lot of environments that have like a lot of shadow IT, or there's a lot of environments that don't have a very good change management program. So there's a lot of assets, and that could be people, that could be applications, software. There's a lot of assets that exist in the environment that, a lot of times the technology teams are unaware of. So that's one of the biggest challenges. And that's why when I ask folks, do you understand your assets? Have you have a list? Do you know what you're trying to protect? Most of the time, they kind of give me the squiggly answer. So it's very important that you understand your assets in totality when you're trying to protect your environment, and that there are limiting factors that you can use to make sure that extra stuff doesn't come in without your knowledge. So that's one of your biggest challenges. The next one is the patch testing window. This is a challenge I've seen usually due to the fact that when a vulnerability comes out, depending on the governance of the organization, sometimes organizations put themselves in a bind because they put their patch window at like a really short window, I guess, to address the risk. But at the same time, like they don't have the capability to do it right. It's really hard to explain. But definitely making sure that you can patch in a timely manner, and don't ever forget about those temporary workarounds. Um, Patching in a timely manner is better than not patching, and having a temporary workaround is better than nothing. So if you remember those, then that challenge may not be so big for you. But the average time from receiving the vulnerability to testing the vulnerability, if you have a test node, if you don't, then testing it in production without breaking something, and then implementing the patch, and making sure that it works without breaking stuff is usually it's pretty long. It's average like over 30 days. So food for thought. The other challenge is legacy systems. So this one's a huge one. And this one is brought on usually by, like I said, a very terrible change management configuration management plan. Because with a part of the change management and configuration management plan is a life cycle. So life cycle being that, hey, we know we're going to buy this product, and we've already evaluated like the risk in our environment, and we know this product, and we're only going to use this product for 5 years, which is a normal life cycle, 5 years. Because usually after 5, I would say no more than 10 years, most companies, they no longer support that product. So getting updates, getting patches without having to like come out of hide. When I say come out of hide, without having to pay significant amounts of revenue in order for you to take advantage of that, it can get costly. So legacy systems seem to be like everywhere. A lot of people implement stuff, and as long as it's working, they just keep it going. But those legacy systems can come back to bite you in the butt because you're no longer, after a certain amount of time, the company itself is no longer supporting it. They're no longer making updates, which the updates allow them to kind of patch the vulnerabilities and the holes in the system that could be exploited. So without that, you just have a brick sitting on your environment with no updates, holes in it, and it can become a risk to you. And especially if that legacy system is tied to a critical component that you've identified in your environment. Say for instance, if that legacy system is tied to like payroll or acquisitions, then you're in more of a bind. So it's very important to kind of keep your hand on the pulse with legacy systems. And the last thing is when I was talking about frameworks earlier, a framework is an organizational thing. It's not an IT department thing. It's not just a tech guy thing. This is a framework that you would implement within your business. So when you're choosing your framework, make sure that the framework matches your business. Cross-team collaboration is absolutely important. And all of these different things that I just identified as challenges earlier can be significantly reduced if you have very good cross-team collaboration. So understanding your assets, if all your departments are talking to your whoever your person is responsible for, maintaining your assets, then you should be good to go. For patching, if your engineers and all of the different departments are talking to each other, then you should be good to go. With the legacy systems, if those components, like for instance, the payroll folks or the acquisition folks, they should be telling you like, hey, we bought the system like 5 years ago. It's like been 6 years. We keep getting this like order from the vendor saying they want us to pay this money, just to update it. Like, can we get something new? Like that's a part of the cross team collaboration that should be happening at organizations in order to alleviate some of these problems. And some of the best business practice. Number one, risk based approach. That's what we were kind of breaking down earlier with the different tools that I identified within the slide deck. So please utilize those. Very defined service level agreements. We talked about that earlier as well, making sure that not only are you enforcing those, but you're very defined, especially if you're using cloud. And I'm speaking from experience. I got burned with cloud before, so I harp on it every chance I get. So make sure you're understanding those third party agreements that you have with your cloud service providers, or even your software as a service. Like any type of a third party agreement, just make sure that it's very explicitly delineated as to whose responsibility is what. The third thing is executive buy-in. When I was talking about earlier, making sure that the vulnerabilities as a part of the vulnerability program is shared with the executives and they understand what it means is very key to getting the buy-in, especially when it comes to resourcing and making sure that all the tools, both technical and non-technical resources that are required to have a very good program um, are supported by the people who make the business decisions and who pulls the purse strings. So you definitely want that executive buy-in. And the last thing is just continuous service improvement or continuous improvement. I always say service. Sorry, I'm an idle guy. So just making sure that everything that you're doing, you're always improving upon it. Whether that's processes, that's governance. Just keep slow steps. Just improving over time, making sure that you're not constantly making the same mistakes or that the same things aren't being done every single time. That's not giving efficient or effective results. All right, so these are the questions that I have set up for the next session that we're going to have, the second session on vulnerability management, when we actually sit down with you, myself and Al. So you're going to get these slides. Go back to your organization, kind of peruse these questions, and then on our next discussion, let's sit down, let's discuss these questions, and I kind of want to walk through, whatever feedback you need from myself. Myself and Al both have tremendous amounts of experience. Our last session we had a very good conversation. Definitely looking to having more conversations to answer your questions as best as we can. And with that, at this time, I'll go ahead and open it for questions, and I will turn it back over to you, Al. I'll just close the slides up so I can see the screen.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you, Gio. I don't see any questions in the chat box right now, so I'll just throw it open to all of you attending. Does anyone have any questions on vulnerability management? Any of the aspects that Gio talked about?
Hey, Al, it's Sarah. How are you?
Hi, hi, Sarah. Good, good. How are you?
I'll lower my hand now. So, I understand about understanding what you're going to protect and then sort of assessing how important critical they are to the business. And that the business sort of says, just because a server goes down, if it impacts something critical, yes, it's something we want to protect. But if a server goes down and, hey, it's just holding my recipes for my baked goods, then maybe it's not a big deal, right? So I get it.
Correct.
And that makes sense to me. What I am curious is that I'm going to take this slide and I'm going to prompt my current partner and say, "Hey, can you tell me?" And my assumption is that these things are happening. I'm on the business side, but again, it's a partnership. You did have on the follow-up questions, one of the things, what's that I wanted to ask, what's best practice? What should I be expecting? I mean, I feel like IT is a specialty and these guys know what's best practice. So my assumption is best practice vulnerability scanning occurs pretty regularly. When I think regularly, I used to think that maybe once a day, 3 times a week. What is best practice? And I'm also going to assume that considering that I'm part of the DIB, that it's probably something I should be like, it better be more than once a week, right? And so, again, it is relative to the space that I happen to be in. Um, but would you recommend that I literally am going to pick up this presentation once it's posted and I'm going to take this to a conversation to have. Um, but I'm also making the huge assumption that people that do this type of stuff are following this type of best practice and that there should be information coming to me as the business partner to say, oh, yeah, that makes sense. Um, so I'm just trying to make sure, I'm asking, I may, I'm approaching the conversation with positive intent. It's like, hey, I assume that we have these tools. They could be named a couple of different things, but I would love to see the output of these tools. So I feel like that's the best way to sort of approach this conversation. Um, yeah, yeah. I just needed to get, I needed to
No,
get that out.
no, you're good, and I'm glad you said you were DIB. So I used to be an auditor for the people who audit your. I don't know if you're possessing or non-possessing as far as your DIB contract. But let's say depending on your DIB contract, so you're either having to identify with NIST 800 171 or NIST
Yes,
853. So if it's
both.
171, if you look into the NIST 171, it
Uh-huh.
actually states verbatim what your scanning requirement is. And I say that because when I was an auditor, when I used to go out to the DIB partner, and
Right.
I would tell them, I was like, hey, so I need to see your scans for this period. You need to show me the scan. Like I need to
Mm-hmm.
see the scan, especially, and I'm looking for, and there's ways to audit to make sure that it was done during that time. Like I had, credentials
Right.
and stuff to look at it, but I'm auditing to make sure it's done. Don't feel any type of way when you approach this because that's your partner, and because it's your partner, you share the risk. So don't be afraid to ask.
Right.
And the ask should be easy. If they're doing it, they'll be able to provide it to you. And if they provide it to you, hopefully they understand, how to explain it to you in terms that you understand, because there's a difference between like when I used to get my briefing for me when I was auditing, there was a technical briefing. Like that was the technical briefing. I was pulling apart firewalls, looking at databases, looking at different servers and different components of the environment.
Right.
But then after I was done, when we went to talk to people like yourself, the executives, I had a completely different briefing. And it was for them so that they can understand like, okay, so based on the risk, the risk that you're accepting or the risk that
Mm-hmm.
you're looking at, here's how it makes sense to you. So hopefully they can transition that for you. But if not, just let me know, and I can get on your schedule.
Okay.
Yeah, I do think that being knowing what to ask for, sort of some of these things that are sort of best practices, I think is a good start. Um, but yes, I definitely will. My point is, I never want to leave a conversation dumber than when I started. I always want to walk away with what is the story because my boss is going to say, what the heck is this mumbo jumbo? She's going to want, an elevator speech that's maybe 30-second soundbite about what the issue is, what you got to do, what happens if I don't do it, what are my options? That's what she's going to ask me. So, as I begin to have this conversation, I will be using this, the slides as soon as they're published. Thank you very much, Al, and taking it as a sort of reference tool going forward. But I do think I need to press a little nicely to these people about where we're trying to go. And yes, our framework is the 800 171 and the 853. But, for the authenticated and unauthenticated scans,
Mm-hmm.
um, I would imagine somebody would be very nervous about having a third party come into their house. And so, at the end of the day, I got to get our organization where it needs to be. So I am really trying to help people understand that it's a good thing. It is a very good thing because it saves us all. It helps us all. And it even could
And,
validate some of what our milestones plan of actions are. So I look at it as a very good thing because we all win in the end.
Yeah.
So
and the reason is because if you I'm trying to think of the best terminology to say, but I was gonna use this murderer thing, but I'm not gonna use it. What when your folks are doing their work, they want to do the best work that they can, and the work to make you executives happy and see them in a light. And I'm not saying they're hiding stuff, but the more you do something, the more you start to understand things and you get comfortable in the environment. It's just different by having that third party come in and assess. It just gives you a different perspective. You're not
mhm.
seeing like what the comfortable people are seeing. You're just getting a complete, hopefully non-biased opinion of what they see.
Okay. All right.
And really, Sarah, as you mentioned and Gio mentioned, it's a partnership in
Mhm.
a sense that the stuff you're seeing here is something you should know about and be aware of, but your technical partner conceptually should be aware of the requirements that are in place for NIST 800-171. But then really applying this from a business perspective is in a sense, you would be contributing in there what the business perspective is, say what the business services are, what's
Mhm.
critical, uh, and then working with your partner to tie the controls to the business services, the business needs. And for your most important services that your company delivers, um, that's where you want to have kind of that full circle in a sense. You want to
Right.
be able to say, what's the framework? What are the controls in there? How are they designed? How are they operating? And what evidence is there that they're operating properly? Um, and then basically, you would be looking at it from a business perspective, and then your technical folks would look at it from the controls perspective. And really, if you can bridge between the two, then you can identify what's the most critical services, where your most critical data is, who your most critical people are, and that'll get you along the road of identifying where your vulnerability.
Right. I think
So,
really right now it's we're coming at it from so many different ways. I attended your cybersecurity conference this past month.
mhm.
Got a lot of good stuff from it. Having lots of conversations here at API about it. Um, but we're back to asking the right question, which is, what are you trying to protect? What's important
Yep,
to you? Prioritizing that.
yep,
And then revisiting again our policies that we've developed based off of the frameworks that we've mentioned
mhm.
and trying to make sense and then developing our system security plan and all that other stuff. Um, but I do think that what it has done is it's made me much more intelligent about how to ask the right questions on things that I should be able to see. And maybe I just need to be educated and nobody's asked them, so they've never provided it. And again, I just want to be able to clear the communication and these sessions have helped me. So I don't want to
Good.
belabor the point, but thank you. So I'll just go back on mute.
No problem, Sarah. And I put a link into the chat that has these resource guides, and they have resource guides for pretty much everything that we're going to be talking about. And one of them is vulnerability management. So take the time, read through it. It'll give you some key pointers and some questions that you can ask.
And I know the topic today was a very meaty topic, so to speak. There's lots of aspects to vulnerability management. So I am going to encourage all of you to try and attend the next session, which is on the 29th of this month. It'll be in person and also we'll have a virtual link. Um, but with this kind of topic, it always benefits to sit down around a table and talk about specifics. And while we may or may not be able to solve every single problem, we can at least identify where the major pain points are. and we can help you a little bit to get further down the road, but you can also help us to design better seminars, better put the right information together that makes more a bigger difference to you folks. So again, we are running well over our time, and I appreciate you guys hanging in there. So we have the next session coming up. I'll be sending an email out after this with a feedback survey and also a survey on whether you'll be able to attend. I'll also include Gio's presentation from today, so you can take it to your folks and really start the process of asking questions, identifying what's working, maybe with where a gap is, and then let's talk about it. You know, in a couple of weeks, we'll get back together, and then hopefully we can explore some more, answer some more questions, but then also hopefully identify other things that you need help with. So with that, normally I throw it open for questions, but I know we're running really, really late. So I'll just say that our follow-on topic after we're done with vulnerability management is going to be secure by demand. I would highly encourage you to attend that. It's the kind of topic that is a key direction for the industry. So we have sessions in August, the first one, which will be informational, and the second one will be September 23rd. So again, the information is out on our website to register if you haven't already. But I encourage you to also think about that topic as well. So with that, I'm going to thank you for attending, and hope to see you again in a couple weeks, and wish you a great rest of the day. Thank you, Gio. It was great as always.
I'm sorry, Al. I did not know what time it was. I could not see the time. I'm so sorry again.
Yeah, I think the topic itself was very meaty, and everything you said was totally appropriate, and I think it hit all the right spots. So now we need to just spend a little more time on it. We'll drill down to more specific. So again, thanks everyone for hanging in there. Appreciate it, and have a great rest of your day, rest of the week. Okay, take care. Bye.